Welcome to NewsX World. I'm Milos Medicek, and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. So what is the situation in the Indo-Pacific? Can China detain foreigners in the South China Sea? Has the world's focus shifted to the Israel-Gaza war? And is it to the advantage of Beijing? Is the Ukraine-China conflict pushing Putin closer to Xi? Let's find out. Joining us now is Cleo Paskal, who has been an associate fellow at the Chatham House. Apart from contributing chapters to the peer-reviewed academic books, Cleo has contributed to some of the world's most renowned publications, including The Economist, The Diplomat, The Independent Condé Nast, Traveller, The Telegraph, and The Times. She has also hosted BBC radio shows. She wrote the primetime Emmy Award-winning TV series Cirque du Soleil, Fire Within. Has the global focus shifted from the Indo-Pacific to Ukraine and Gaza? Is it working in China's favor?
Yeah, so I think that the parts of the globes are different. So if you're in Japan, for example, the focus is still very much the Indo-Pacific, but within the US, within Washington, D.C., you certainly do have very large sections coming from all sorts of interests that are trying to kind of focus more on the traditional Atlanticist concerns or else Middle East issues. And there's less awareness on the Indo-Pacific. That said, when Indo-Pacific issues come to the fore, we recently had an issue where there was a critical piece of legislation related to support for strategic Pacific islands that have long-term and deep relationships with the U.S. That piece of legislation, once it was clear that it was at threat, actually made it through the House, whereas legislation related to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel has been much more controversial and hasn't gotten as far as quickly. So it really depends on who's involved and how widespread the understanding of the strategic threat is, especially, it's odd to say in DC, but especially at the staff level within Congress.
Do you think Taiwan being nuclear capable is going to deter China from attacking Taiwan?
It's very difficult for me to say that. That's not kind of my place. It's such a big decision for a country. What we've seen from Chinese behavior generally is, they don't have, they want to go for the easiest path. And so if it looks like a country is going to actually defend itself, then it's going to think twice. And this is one of the things that India did, was after Galwan especially, really make itself a much, much harder target. And there's no question that that affected China's calculations around how it's going to try to push around India. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan has been a stated goal of the PRC for a very long time. And the harder a target it makes itself, I would expect, based on past behavior from the CCP, you'd think the more likely it would be to make China think twice. But there are other things other than kinetic warfare that will make China think twice. So if, for example, the US started saying, if you run another spy balloon over our country, we're going to reevaluate the Bank of China's operating license, then make it think twice about activities. And again, this is why when Galwan happened and India banned the 59 apps, including TikTok and WeChat, that was such an effective hit. So just because we're talking about kinetic warfare, yes, of course, you have to defend yourself against any aggression as much as you can. But in terms of how you defend yourself, the toolkit is very, very wide. And maybe to think about some of the political warfare methods of retaliation and protection.
With China and Russia and Iran coming closer, what impact will it have on Indo-Pacific?
China, Russia, and Iran coming closer is definitely not ideal. For a lot of reasons. And they're kind of different pieces of it. And it also depends a little bit on your definition of the Indo-Pacific. So we've seen increasing activity of those three in Latin America, for example. And to get to Latin America, you have to go through the Pacific. And if the activity in Latin American zone becomes a priority for some of them, and we see a lot of Iranian activity, for example, in Latin America, then those routes through the Pacific in order to get to Latin America become more important. So we know that, for example, China and Russia operating in the Arctic also depends on the Pacific, because you have to get China, wants to get up through the Bering Strait in order to get into the Arctic zone. So you have the obvious ones like Russia and China circumnavigating Japan. You have on the ground criminal activity that seems to be operating together, but you also have sections of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and you can see it with what's happening with the Houthis, for example, leading into other areas where those three coming together with different importances in the braiding, different locations, sorry, being a conduit for crime, for political warfare operations, and ultimately potentially for kinetic activity in a much broader scope of the world than you might expect.
Can AUKUS prevent Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific?
So as with for if Taiwan should go nuclear or if Japan should go nuclear, every country in the region should be assessing China at its word in terms of its kinetic ambitions. And any allies working together is a good thing. And you can usually get a sense of how effective something is by what you see in the Chinese press in response to it. And the Chinese press hates AUKUS and tries to use proxies to deride it and to create fractures in it. So when it first came out, for example, there was a lot of framing of this being, an Anglo sort of alliance, and back to the old colonial days and things, like pushing on a lot of those buttons in order to bring other countries on side with the Chinese way of seeing things and trying to undermine it. So if you see that kind of ramping up of political warfare around an issue, then you know that you've struck a nerve. So in that respect, I don't have to say that AUKUS is effective. The Chinese think AUKUS could be effective. But again, I would just say that China works across the entire unrestricted warfare battlefield. And just focusing on a kinetic response may not be the most effective way. You do need to do the kinetic, there's absolutely no question, but there are also other tools in the toolkit that could be deployed that can also cause a lot of rethinking in Beijing about its aggressive activities.
How can the Quad be strengthened? Can it expand into a military bloc? How soon should that happen?
It would be helpful if sections of it were more institutionalized. So if there were, headquarters and things like that. From what I understand, there are pretty regular meetings now. These are very different countries, obviously, and have different ways of operating. And India's way of operating and Japan's way of operating, for example, are, I would argue, much more complex and do include more of these other mechanisms in their way of interacting with countries, because the world is not black and white. India has a lot of its own relationships that other Quad members don't like, bluntly. And India has them for a whole range of reasons that make sense to the majority of the Indian strategic community. So you can't, and Australia, for example, might talk a good game about China in many cases to Pacific Islanders, for example. Sorry, but then the Prime Minister will go on a trade visit to China, and what sort of a message does that send? So, for the countries to be effective, I think that yes, there are definitely overlapping areas, which could be much better operationalized. And some of them are military, some of them are technological. But I think one of the areas that would really, really make a difference is actually, sorry, on this political warfare battlefield. So if you're looking at countries in, for example, the Pacific, I look a lot at the Pacific Islands, and it's a big section of the Indo-Pacific. China enters into those economies because there's very little competition of the sort that India could provide. So if you look at a place like Solomon Islands, um, which has been engaged with Australia for many years. In fact, it was an Australian possession until 1975 or so. You you could build that China is trying to sway the next election by saying it will build a hospital after the election. There should have been a hospital built there a long time ago. Building hospitals in this sort of location is the sort of thing India is very good at. And in fact, when Prime Minister Modi went to Papua New Guinea, he talked about a whole range of very welcome medical engagements. Now, it's difficult for India because it doesn't have diplomatic representation in many of these countries. And so that sort of collaboration where you're bringing in the low cost, very effective Indian solutions to the ground level problems that a lot of people are living with and that China is trying to enter societies through, built into the engagement that comes with the Japanese development or the American or the cause a real shift in the ground realities across many sections of the Indo-Pacific. So understanding again that the way that China disrupts societies is very, very broad. And to include those Indian tools into the toolkit for creating stability and prosperity and all of the things that came out from India's vision at the G20 would potentially be a way of making the Quad really effective across a broad range of unrestricted warfare, protective sectors.
Can you trust the United States to fight China in Indo-Pacific?
If you mean kinetically, so the U.S. is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. It has Hawaii, but very far, several thousand kilometers to the west of that, is Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is America. So they're in the process now of building up divert airfield in Tinian, doing expansions in Guam. There was just an announcement of a $400 million airfield redevelopment in Yap in the Federation for a consolidation or reassessment of U.S. ability to be able to operate. Now, interestingly, in many cases, it seems to be Air Force, whereas traditionally you would have thought it was Navy, and the Navy is having some serious problems, and the Marines are also having some serious problems in terms of having the equipment they need to be able to fight kinetically. So if you're kind of reading the tea leaves on it, you can see that especially in the Department of Defense, there is a lot of concern about it, and they're trying to be able to be in a position to be more effective with allies. I think that also this is ultimately a political decision. And one of the things that seems to be happening is that there seems to be more of a willingness to share the tools to defend themselves with allies in the region, in case possibly, I mean, first of all, because it's just being a good ally, but second of all, if the political will isn't in there in Washington to act quickly or effectively to make sure that allies have more of the tools they need to defend themselves. And you see that in, for example, the budget stuff around Taiwan. You've got more American military training in Taiwan, things like that. This is what does an attack look like in the Indo-Pacific? China's going to try to keep it. Either it's going to be overwhelming, or it'll try to do what it's currently doing, which is keep it below the response threshold. A lot's going to depend, I'd say, probably on the US election. But there is definitely concern by serious people that within Washington that they want to be able to be there if allies need them.
Thank you, Cleo Paskal, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of The Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned to NewsX World.